lot to talk about, so I think we will get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Amy Goins. This is the session on the Open Meetings Act Review and Reform. So if that's what you were expecting, you're in the right room, and if not, you may be in the wrong room. First, we are going to have the panelists introduce themselves, and I will give you a brief outline of what we're going to discuss today. First, we're going to have a review of basics of the Open Meetings Act. So what has changed and what hasn't changed with remote and virtual meetings. And we will discuss the Attorney General's recent findings involving remote virtual meetings. Then we will launch into a conversation about how municipalities have adapted through technology, what changes we've seen. Then we'll discuss what changes should be made to the Open Meetings Act to update it for a world post-COVID, post-pandemic, which we're all hoping we see sooner rather than later. And finally, there will be a question and answer session, which you'll be able to submit questions, I think, at any time using the Q&A function on this platform. I think we will address questions at the end, but feel free to pose the questions at any point. I'm also going to launch a couple polls just to gauge your own comfort level and interest in remote meetings. And we might do one at the end to see if anything in this session has made you more or less comfortable. All right, so let's get into the introductions, and we will try to do it in order of speaker. So first, I'm going to ask Kate Sadek from the AG's office to introduce herself.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kate Sadek. I'm a Special Assistant Attorney General, and I'm Chief of the Open Government Unit at the Attorney General's office.
Ashley, why don't you go next, followed by Sean?
Hi, everybody. I'm Ashley Sweet. I'm a project manager with Weston and Sampson, and also the town planner in Situate and planner in Exeter.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean Selleck. I am the city clerk for the city of Providence, and I also bring a previous career with me, heavy in technology. And that's what we're talking about this topic.
Hi, I'm Amy Stewart. I'm an attorney with the Rhode Island Department of Business Regulation. Serve as legal counsel to 6 of our boards, and I've worked with most of our 14 boards at DBR. And in that role, I became tasked by Director Elizabeth Tanner to prepare and lead a working group, which includes everybody here on this panel, on developing a Zoom guide for best practices for public meetings. So notwithstanding my state employment, that's what brought me here today.
I'm Amy Goins with Ursillo, Tights and Rich in Providence. We represent on Rhode Island and other public entities. And I've lost count of how many Zoom meetings I've been to this year, as I'm sure all of you had. So as I mentioned, I will launch a couple polls, but I think I'm going to wait till after we have our first presentation. Please do bear with us if we have any technical difficulties. There might be some audio or video delays. So now I am momentarily going to bring up the presentation that Attorney Sadek will offer.
Great, thanks, Amy. So as I mentioned, I'm the Chief of the Open Government Unit at the Attorney General's office, and my presentation to start us off today is going to focus on the current legal requirements for holding open meetings in light of COVID-19. And then a number of the other panelists are going to talk about their experiences with open meetings and also some ideas for moving forward and what's next with regard to virtual meetings. So just to make a distinction up front, my role and my focus today, and the focus of our unit, is really on education around the legal requirements of the Open Meetings Act and enforcement of those requirements. So I'm not really here today to take a position necessarily on any of the policy ideas that the other panelists might be discussing, But it's my intent to really lay a foundation that hopefully can be a good springboard for the rest of the conversation that will follow. It's certainly a very, very important conversation to be having and very timely, and we're glad that all of you could join us to have this discussion today. So let's get started. Under the Open Meetings Act itself, meeting virtually or through electronic means is generally prohibited, except in some very limited circumstances that are described in the statute. In March of 2020, the governor first issued an executive order modifying those provisions of the OMA and permitting virtual meetings if they're for an essential purpose. In the many months since March 2020, when COVID really precipitated these changes, the governor has continued to issue executive orders permitting virtual meetings. There were some changes made to the initial executive order, and Executive Order 20-46, which was issued back in June, reflects the current requirements for holding open meetings under the executive order. This executive order has been continuously renewed since June, most recently by Executive Order 21-01, which is currently in place through February 4th. Because these changes are taking place through executive orders, they generally have to be renewed roughly every 30 days or so. So let's look at Executive Order 20-46, which sets the current legal requirements. Under this executive order, the provisions of the OMA that prohibit meeting by electronic means are suspended, and public bodies are allowed to conduct meetings through adequate alternative means. Unlike the original executive order in March, there's no requirement that the meeting be for an essential purpose. You can hold a virtual open meeting for any purpose. And in fact, under this executive order, any meeting that you have has to take place using adequate alternative means, even if it also takes place in person. The executive order also notes that if some law requires public participation, then that has to be provided for in a virtual meeting. And otherwise, all the other usual requirements of the Open Meetings Act remain in place unless it's something that was specifically modified by the executive order. We'll look at the next slide now, and this looks at what are adequate alternative means. Those are measures that ensure transparency and that permit the public to clearly follow along in meetings in real time. So means such as video conferencing. Zoom is a popular option. Under the executive order, these adequate alternative means must be provided for free. And importantly, even if a public body is able to meet in person, under the executive order, the public body must also offer the public adequate alternative means through which they can access the meeting. And I think what we're already seeing and may see more and more of are hybrid meetings, where the meeting has an in-person component, but also has a virtual component. And our office actually issued a finding related to that, which I'll talk more about a little bit later on. The next slide looks at posting notice requirements. And the key takeaway here is that all of the normal requirements for posting notice remain in place. As usual, under the OMA, notice must be posted at least 48 hours in advance of the meeting, excluding weekends and holidays, and it must be posted in 3 locations as described in the statute. Now, I know some public bodies may have issues with posting physical notice in the locations where they normally would, as required by the statute. What I would suggest you to think about if you can't post inside a building is to either find another building or to consider posting notice on the outside door of a building. I know some public bodies have asked if posting on a website is sufficient and can count as one of those 3 places set forth in the Open Meetings Act. The answer to that is that our office issued a finding several years ago where we determined that a website did not count as one of those 3 locations. Now, our findings are, of course, based on the particular circumstances in a given case, the particular arguments that were made to us in that case. This isn't an issue that we've examined recently, but given that precedent, the safest course would still be to post in physical locations as you normally would. And if you want to post on a website as well, that's great. The more notice, the better. We encourage that. But I would encourage you just to not count on that being one of the 3 places required under the statute. One final note is that for the place item on your agenda, you should make sure to list both the physical location where the meeting is taking place, if there is a physical location, as well as the means for accessing the meeting remotely, such as a website address. We can look now at executive session. Once again, the normal executive session requirements in the Open Meetings Act continue to apply. A public body may use virtual means to meet in executive session as long as all the other normal requirements for meeting in executive session are satisfied. Keep in mind that the OMA requires an open call in open session prior to entering executive session, and also requires a reporting out of any votes that took place in executive session, pursuant to the provisions of the statute. So keep in mind that you can meet virtually in executive session, but you still have to make sure you comply with those open call and reporting out requirements. The next slide goes over just some other considerations. As we know, the OMA does not require public comment, but public comment is often very valuable to members of the public, and there are times where some other statute or rule might require public participation. If that's the case, make sure that you're complying with any public participation requirements in the law and in the executive order itself. Also, remember to comply with all applicable non-discrimination laws and ensure that meetings, even if they're virtual, are open and accessible to persons with disabilities. I'd encourage you to write on the notice for a meeting, provide a way that members of the public can let you know if they need an accommodation. And that way you're ensuring that your virtual meetings continue to be accessible and to continue to comply with all of the OMA's requirements. All right, we can move on now. And what I'd like to do is just to touch upon some findings that our office has issued in the course of the last year that pertain to virtual meetings. The first one we'll look at is Diorio. In this Diorio finding, the complainant alleged that the public body held a virtual meeting, but that not all of the agenda items pertained to an essential purpose. Now, you might recall, as I mentioned at the beginning, that the governor's first executive order in March allowing virtual meetings required that the meeting be for an essential purpose. That requirement was later removed from the executive order. So what we did here in this finding is, first of all, we noted that there was no evidence that a violation, assuming it had occurred, was willful or knowing. And there was no evidence of there being any need for injunctive relief of any sort. In these circumstances, we determined that it was unnecessary to decide whether or not a violation had occurred, because it was undisputed that the alleged conduct would be permissible under the current version of the executive order. So the takeaway here is that under the executive order, as it's been in place now for many months, since at least June, you can meet virtually for any purpose. It does not need to be limited to an essential purpose. The next finding we'll look at is the Alquist finding. In this case, the complainant alleged that he was unable to access a meeting that was being conducted virtually via Zoom. So our office investigated and we gathered evidence. And the evidence that we gathered showed that the public body had posted notice on the Secretary of State's website, providing a link of how the meeting could be accessed remotely. The evidence also showed that other members of the public were able to access the meeting, that the public body had not received any reports of anyone having trouble accessing the meeting, and that there was no evidence that the alleged failure or inability of the complainant to access the meeting was due to a failure on the part of the public body. So in these specific circumstances, we determined that there was no violation. When we deal with these issues regarding an alleged lack of ability to access a public meeting, it's really going to be a fact-intensive inquiry. The key is the public body must provide public access to the meeting. And I'd really encourage public bodies to look at this through a common sense perspective. If you're conducting a meeting and you start to receive reports of people having difficulty accessing the meeting, if you have reason to believe that people may not be able to access the meeting, then you may need to pause, see if the issue can be fixed, and maybe even reschedule the meeting. Now, that might not always be necessary. If one individual is having a problem connecting and it is due to an issue on their end, then there might not be a need to reschedule the meeting or to stop the meeting. It might really depend on the circumstances in that particular case that are in front of you. But the key is that there must be public access. The public body must provide free public access to the meeting. The next complaint that we'll look at and finding that we issued is the Pearson finding. This is a very important one. In this case, the complainant alleged that several public bodies had held an in-person meeting but failed to offer a way for the public to access the meeting through adequate alternative means. And we found a violation because the public bodies acknowledged that they met in person, but they did not provide a way for the public to access the meeting remotely. This is important because what the public body did here would have been perfectly fine prior to the executive orders and prior to COVID-19. They held a meeting in person. However, the executive order adds an extra requirement that even if you are able to meet in person, you must still offer members of the public a way to access the meeting remotely. And I think the purpose of the governor including this requirement is really a recognition that in times of COVID-19, there are real restrictions on the capacity for people to gather in person together. A lot of people may not be able to leave their homes or gather with other people for health reasons or other concerns. And this requirement ensures that members of the public are able to access and observe open meetings, even if they can't physically be there for them. So keep that in mind, that any meeting you have under the current executive order, as long as it's in effect, must offer adequate alternative means to access the meeting, even if the meeting is taking place in person as it normally would under the OMA. Now we'll look at one final finding that was issued related to virtual meetings. The Fierro finding. In this case, the complainant alleged that a public body held a meeting and that she was not able to turn on her video, display signs, or type in the chat box and express her thoughts on what was being discussed at the meeting. Our office recounted that under the Open Meetings Act, there's no legal requirement for members of the public to be able to express themselves verbally or non-verbally at a meeting. So we determined that there was no violation. Of course, the important thing to keep in mind here is that the OMA and the executive orders are a floor, not a ceiling. And we always encourage public bodies to go above and beyond the minimum requirements of the OMA when it's feasible to do so. So keep that in mind, to always, really just for the sake of transparency and openness in government, to find ways to try to encourage public participation and permit it even in virtual meetings when it's feasible to do so. So the last slide here just shows some contact information for the Open Government Unit. We're available as a resource. We've put out a guidance and FAQ document that you can find on our website that goes over some questions and guidance around the executive order. Our contact information is here. If you're a member of a public body and you have a solicitor, we'd encourage you to go to your solicitor for your legal advice. But in general, we're always available as a resource. We hope that we can be helpful. And I'm glad that we're here and having this conversation together today and really talking about these important, timely issues related to open meetings. I'll turn it back over to Amy now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kate. That was a great overview. All right, as I mentioned, I'm going to launch a couple polls. See if you can answer them just for our own amusement, I guess. We're going to ask how comfortable are you or your community with remote meetings? And we're also curious to know whether you think remote access to public meetings should be made permanent. Now we are going to have a conversation between Ashley Sweet and Sean Selleck on how municipalities have adapted. And Ashley or Sean, I'll let you decide which one wants to kick it off first.
I think Ashley is expecting me to go, and so I can launch into my presentation. Yeah. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to walk through a brief history of the City of Providence's adaptation to virtual meetings, just to summarize where we started and how we arrived to our current position. And to set the foundation for what I hope will be a more valuable discussion of the impacts of the changes that we've adopted. And panelists Amy Stewart and Amy Goins will dive into some of those impacts shortly. But I just wanted to set the stage through an understanding of the journey that we've taken over the past 10 months. Providence City Hall closed last March due to the pandemic, like many, if not all, of the city halls across the state. And I came to work to an almost empty and mostly dark City Hall on a Monday, knowing that we had a regular City Council meeting scheduled for that Thursday. And we had to identify, test, and train people on a virtual meeting platform within 3 days. There was a photo posted on social media of us clerking that first virtual meeting, and it's clear that almost all of the council members had joined by phone. Because of all the boxes on the Zoom screen representing the members, only Council President Sabina Matos was on video. Now, of course, all of our council members are able to join a meeting with a webcam, but that doesn't mean that they wish to or that they're comfortable doing so. So the question is raised, should they have to? And what are reasonable standards for virtual public meetings, and which of those standards should be required by law? That's basically what I feel one of the main reasons for this session is. And we panelists hope that along with ideas from the audience, we can move that discussion forward. And we really hope that you'll participate in the Q&A session after our initial presentations. So how have we in Providence adapted to technology, through technology? Being a larger city, we were quickly forced to address security and privacy concerns, which we did through moving from Zoom meetings, which was designed as a collaboration tool for businesses, to Zoom webinars, which was designed for presentations. The reality is that Zoom bombing, which most of you, if not all, are familiar with, when someone wants to deliberately interrupt your meeting, it usually isn't as rewarding when the target is a meeting that only has a handful of attendees. So many small meeting bodies are less likely to experience disruption from guests during one of their meetings. Those bodies may opt to stick with a platform that has fewer security features in order to take advantage of other features. For example, if you use the Zoom platform, breakout rooms and waiting rooms are very useful for those using Zoom meetings, but those tools are not available if you're using the Zoom webinar platform. And those of you who have hosted a Zoom meeting may know that it's easier for someone to interrupt the meeting than it is on the webinar, where attendees are not visible or audible unless the host wants to make them so. One of the other significant adaptations that we've made is to launch an online portal that allows the real-time posting of documentation that would have been distributed in person in a non-virtual meeting. I know a lot of public bodies adapted to virtual meetings by moving up deadlines for documentation so that it could be distributed via email ahead of a meeting or posted along with the public agenda. That approach definitely helps, but we really wanted to find a way to be able to introduce a document during a meeting and provide the public the same access to that document that members had. So we are using an Atlassian product called Confluence, which allows me to upload and provide a link to a file instantaneously. I often do this in the middle of a meeting, so attendees are literally waiting for me for a few moments when I'm asked to virtually distribute a new document, and a link to a fixed web page where the documents can be accessed is always printed on the meeting agenda and does not change for a particular committee. So the public and elected officials always know where to go for a document they haven't seen before. There's one other adaptation that I'm excited to announce during this panel. We actually have not tried this yet. We haven't made this adaptation, but we will this evening for the first time. So that's a little teaser that I'll leave until the end of my presentation. But before I describe it and hand things over to Ashley to hear about her interesting hybrid virtual meeting experiences, I'd like to share one example of a hybrid meeting that we've been doing here in Providence. I'm sure many of you serve members of a public body that feel discomfort with aspects of virtual meetings or prefer to physically be in a meeting room. I think it's really interesting to walk through the mechanics of how meeting facilitators, often clerks, serve those members. We have some chairs of committees here that want to be in City Hall as the sole member of a meeting body with their paperwork before them and a socially distanced clerk supporting them. The challenge in this situation is how to handle the audio of the clerk and the chair simultaneously. I hope anyone facilitating virtual public meetings has found the guide that's now hosted on the homepage of the Rhode Island Department of Business Regulation that explains a lot about the importance of clear audio during a virtual meeting. But the way that we handle it here is we actually have one device that uses its webcam. In our case, it's actually a Chromebook that sits in front of the chairperson. And they log on to the meeting and they join that meeting via phone with phone audio. They use the phone audio option, which that phone that they use is a Polycom speakerphone. This Polycom speakerphone is located between the clerk, myself, and the chair, so that that Polycom can actually pick up the audio clearly from both of us. Meanwhile, I'm on the other side of the room, and I have my own laptop, which has my own webcam, which is not connected to audio at all, because if we had two microphones, then you get a lot of feedback with the speakers coming out and being picked up by the other one. And so my audio is being picked up by that speakerphone as well as the chairperson's audio at the same, whenever one of us is speaking. So it does appear on the Zoom meeting, the little box that lights up around the speaker. The one that's always lighting up is the chair's box. It always appears as if the chair is speaking and not myself. But that is the way that we avoid any type of feedback and keep the audio clear. So finally, I'll share my exciting news. At least I think it's exciting. It's an adaptation that we're going to make for the first time this evening. And it's to address a problem that came up on a panel that I participated in a few months ago about virtual meetings, where a journalist, and I'll give her a shout out, to Steph Machado, complained about not being able to see who was attending our meetings as an attendee, because in the Zoom webinar platform, a panelist can see all the panelists and all the attendees, but an attendee can only see the other panelists. It can only see the panelists. They cannot see the other attendees. And that is information that's hidden from the public that it shouldn't be. And so this evening, for the first time, we will be hosting a Providence committee meeting where a journalist, and it will be Steph, I believe, will be given a panelist invitation. She'll be muted and have her camera off, but she will be able to see all of the attendees and be able to speak, to who attended, how many people attended, if she's writing some type of journalistic piece about the meeting. Thank you very much. That's all I have, and now I'll pass things over to Ashley and look forward to hearing some more anecdotes.
Hi, everybody. So Sean gave you the big city picture, and I'm going to give you the small town version of what we went through when I was the town planner in Exeter and as the consulting planner in the town of Scituate. So when the pandemic started, we stepped back and said, okay, we're going to pause. We're not going to hold any meetings right now. So unlike the city of Providence, we did not have the immediate need to meet, at least at the planning board level. We stepped back and said, let's see what happens and we'll go from there. So we waited, and obviously, as we know now, things did not get better, they got worse. And we, at that point, needed to figure out a way to resolve the issue and to move forward and actually have the ability to hold a meeting. So in Exeter, for example, we very, very quickly learned how to use Zoom and started regular planning board meetings again. I want to say probably about 3 months after we were told that we could not meet in person anymore. So we had a lapse of time there where there was no meeting, but then picked it up with Zoom and started holding meetings in a regular form of Zoom, not in the webinar form, which worked out well because the groups were usually pretty small and there wasn't a large number of people to manage there. And in Scituate, we have now come around to a hybrid type of model where we've provided the ability for applicants and the interested public to come in and to come into town hall in person and participate in the meeting that way. And it's done with all social distancing requirements in place. And if we exceed capacity, they'll kind of rotate people in and out of the building. Using a camera in the building and having actually the town hall is a Zoom participant. So when I'm sitting at home participating in the meeting, I actually can see town hall as a Zoom participant, and the public is able to participate in that way. The planning board members have remained remote. Staff, for the most part, has remained remote. There is a staff person in town hall, and there's an IT person in town hall that is kind of running that equipment and rotating people and cleaning the microphone and cleaning the podium. But it has given people the opportunity to either participate in an in-person setting for those who may have technological issues or just would prefer to actually physically be present, but it's also retained that virtual presence to allow additional participation by people who are not comfortable entering the building. It's given applicants the ability to also do it in a hybrid sense where they can have expert witnesses remain as remote participants with sometimes the applicant in person or the applicant and their attorney, or maybe just the attorney in person. And that has really worked well in a lot of settings. I know, it's a welcome setup for applicants who are paying experts. They don't have to spend the whole night sitting in the meeting. They can come in and out as needed. And so that's two ways that have adapted that don't have a lot of resources, that don't have the budget to do high-end technological setups. You can accomplish that with relatively low cost, low technology mechanisms that are easy for the average user to operate. There are no big screens or projectors or any really expensive equipment to have accomplished that hybrid setup in Scituate. So although we're not doing it currently because of current circumstances, we expect to move back into that hybrid setting. Again, giving the public that wants to be there the ability to come in, and the applicants that want to be there the ability to come in and do that dual meeting where you can both attend public in person and virtually. I'll hand it off now to Amy and Amy.
Sure. Thanks, Ashley. And before we do that, I think there was some technical difficulties when Sean was speaking, and I've seen a few people ask about, Sean, if you could reiterate, you can avoid feedback during a hybrid meeting, that would be helpful.
Sure. I'll just quick summary, and I hope it comes through clearly. In a nutshell, what we've been doing is only using one audio device. So I've been socially distanced from a chairperson in the same room, chairing some meetings and clerking them physically together, but socially distanced, with a Polycom speakerphone kind of halfway between us, or at least somewhere we can pick up both of our voices. As long as it's not too annoying or such a negative for it to be viewed that only the audio is coming from one person, because we use, if you use the Zoom platform, and this information is also in the guide on the DBR website, there's an option for you to use phone audio. So even though you join the platform with Zoom on your computer and you're using the webcam, you can click on the little arrow next to the microphone in your lower left-hand corner, and there's an option to join with phone audio, and you dial in with a phone. So we're actually using the telephone for the audio portion of the data, and we only have one microphone. Basically, that telephone is the audio for both myself and the chairperson, because it can pick up our voices from across the room. I know that some of you that might be trying hybrid meetings with more than 2 people or 3 people, it's going to become really difficult. I'm sure we're going to have some more panels in the future talking about how to solve that problem when we're getting different levels of hybrid meetings, but that's how we're at least doing it with just a couple of people right now.
Thanks, Sean. And I've seen other questions come up in the chat box. We'll do those questions at the end of the session. And now Amy Stewart is going to talk about the changes that might be made to the Open Meetings Act, making some of the provisions of the governing executive order permanent.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Amy. So I've been working with everybody on this panel and some other members of state and municipal government at different levels, and also some IT staff members, as well as Jen Slattery and Brian Daniels from the League, and John Marion from Common Cause in our working group that has evolved starting in the summer for the Zoom best practices guide that Sean mentioned, that's on DBR's website, in the blue box under the COVID information if anybody is looking for it. So this working group was asked to start looking at how do we turn the executive order perhaps into legislation? And as we started talking about that, there were clearly 2 different time periods. There's what is necessary during the pandemic, and what do we want the post-pandemic Open Meetings Act to look like? And you know, working with state boards, I am both legal counsel and the Zoom host to 6 different DBR boards. There are 5-member boards and 9-member boards. They handle licensing. We don't have a lot of public participation, but many other DBR boards are much bigger and do. So I see at the state level and recognize at the local level that there are many various challenges that we're all facing every day with virtual meetings or hybrid meetings. But what I think is undeniable is that the public has benefited from this with the ease of attending meetings, especially meetings in the evening. You don't need a babysitter, you don't need to find a parking space or get through traffic to get to your town council or your school committee meeting, maybe a zoning board meeting. And I mean, we're seeing more participation at the state level as well. So, going back to the pre-COVID status quo for all boards, I think is just going to be impossible. There's going to be demand from good government groups, at least for some level of virtual public participation. And what does that look like? So the working group is talking about legislation that will codify the existing executive order requirements, which means that in-person meetings need to have a virtual requirement during the pandemic. It's necessary for public health, and we all recognize that there's going to be some time after some restrictions are lifted that there's going to be a lot of hesitancy among maybe board members, staff, and members of the public to congregate in these small rooms again, in these small meeting rooms that we have. People have been separate for a long time. It's going to take a while to get vaccines, and we're going to be in this for a while. But one of the challenges that we face as we've discussed this as the working group is that we're really raising more questions than answers as to what the post-pandemic Open Meetings Act should look like when it comes to virtual participation by both board members and by the public. So some of the things that we're thinking about is, there's both what level of virtual and remote participation by board members will be permitted. There have been some suggestions that there needs to be a quorum in person and that board members could only participate remotely for a really good reason. But, I would say from the state level, I have many board members who are loving participating remotely, and it's been a benefit to them. So, where do we find that happy medium of seeing them in person and making it easier to participate and attend meetings where many of these board members across state and municipal entities are volunteers at a lot of the different levels. So that's going to be a question for the board member participation. Can they participate remotely? Is the public required to be able to participate remotely? And if so, we will have to prepare for that. But the public's required to be able to participate remotely right now. So everybody should be able to have at least a Zoom meeting. Hybrid meetings are more complicated. Zoom, WebEx, Teams. That's the simplest way if everybody's on their own device. Referring to what Sean said about the sharing microphones, if that's where you get a lot of feedback. So what, there are, I believe the Secretary of State's office said there are like over 3,700 entities subject to the Open Meetings Act. And I'm sure there's a multitude of entities under each municipality. But where is your highest demand for public participation that's online? Is it the council, the school committee, planning and zoning? Where else? Where is that line? Like post-pandemic, when we're allowed to gather again safely, do all the boards need to be virtual or just a certain category of them? We would really appreciate feedback as to where do we draw that line for municipalities, because how many hundreds of that 3,800, 3,700 entities subject to OMA are within the 39 cities and towns. So that's something to think about. Also to think about, there are pros and cons experienced by both the staff of the entities, the board members, and then the public with these meetings. I mean, it's been a tremendous amount of work for us as staff, the clerks, all of the support staff, to adapt to these meetings, to train our members. We have put a lot of effort in, and it's been difficult, but there have been some rewards to have more public participation, to easier to get a quorum sometimes because people are, it's easier for them to join if they're out of state or the weather is bad, or maybe they're not feeling well, and people are gonna think twice with a stuffy nose in the future before they go to work or go to a public meeting in a small room, given the nature of the public health situation now. So while it does require investments in technologies and kind of really adapting and working really hard, there are still some benefits. And we're all suffering through the technology glitches and the difficulty. And even right here, we're having audio problems. So we're all have been suffering through both of that. But the feedback really is, how is it going right now with your virtual meetings? And post-pandemic, which entities within the municipal jurisdiction should be required to have virtual participation by the public and allowed to have board member participation, because that is to the benefit of the agency when getting a quorum. I don't think we'll be able to go back to do all in person. So we really have to kind of think about where is the demand, where do we have the highest levels of public participation, and start planning for that future. Thank you, Amy.
Thanks. I'm not sure if anyone can see the poll results yet, so I'm going to end the polls so we can see our results here. And the first question we wanted to ask was, how comfortable are you or your community with remote meetings? And it looks like most of you are either very comfortable or somewhat comfortable. There were only a handful of folks who reported not comfortable or very uncomfortable. So that's good news. We've been at it for going on, what, a year? Not quite, but that's good news. And then we asked, should remote access to public meetings be made permanent? It seems like the majority said either yes, under the same conditions as in the executive order in place now, or yes, under different conditions. It looks like most of you don't think that this option should continue. And I don't know whether we can take that as evidence that the General Assembly may eventually agree. I guess time will tell on that. In preparing for this session, in speaking with the other folks, and in particular with Sean, Sean made a very insightful point, and I wondered if he would bring it up today. I don't want to steal his thunder or put words in his mouth, but Sean, you said something along the lines of the clerks basically have an entirely new job description from, you know, what you signed up for, what you thought you were getting into. And that's a really important point because, you know, the logistics for organizing a meeting pre-COVID were, you know, post the agenda and make sure, you know, open the door and turn the lights on. And now it's about 1,000 times more complicated. And complicating that, Sean, I think you'll agree with me. You're probably among the upper end of I'll say, you know, tech savvy clerks and municipal employees in general, right? Other than the municipal employees who are IT experts, most of them I think you know, have best efforts, but like me, right? I realize I'm quickly you know, I'm not a Gen Z person, I'm a millennial, and I'm not on the forefront of technology anymore. So that leads me to this point. Your solicitor's job has changed, but don't forget that you still need to rely on the advice of your solicitor. So previously, if the solicitor had an open meetings question, at least as far as getting the, you know, the room on, can the meeting go forward? It was pretty much limited to has the OMA been complied with? Has the agenda been posted within 48 hours? You know, are we in the right place, the right room? Was the building locked? Things like that. Easy questions. Now it's much more complicated. And I think all of the municipal employees in here need to make sure that you've had those detailed conversations with your solicitor about the nitty-gritty of how the meetings are set up and run on whatever platform you're using. I think for most of us it's Zoom. Some of us were doing a conference call option at the beginning. But if you haven't had that conversation, now's the time. And now's the time, even if you've been doing it for several months. As we heard from Attorney Sadek, the requirements haven't changed, but it's helpful to think about, now that we've got the bare, you know, the bare minimum, the basics down, how can we improve the experience for everyone? I know it's tough asking a lot. You know, some of us try to go above and beyond, and that's good. If you can go above and beyond the requirements of the Open Meetings Act, that might help in the event that you know, you get a complaint over a violation. That's just unofficial advice. But I would encourage all of you to have those detailed conversations with your solicitor. And I was also dismayed to hear, I guess, the clerk's recently, and I don't think there was widespread understanding maybe, or at least not everyone was aware that the current executive order requires adequate alternative access, a Zoom option for all public meetings. So make sure that you are in contact with your solicitor. And if your solicitor, isn't up to speed with the details of Zoom, well, tell them you need to get up to speed, because that's part of our duty of competence, right? We have a duty to know the Open Meetings Act, and now that it's been extended to a virtual context, we have to brush up some of our technical skills. So that's about it for my presentation, and now I will try to moderate a Q&A section, and I will try to toss some of these questions to, at first, the person I think might be most appropriate, but then I don't know if there's a raise hand feature. Maybe we can do physically raising our hands. Let's try to have a discussion. Okay, and by the way, there is a chat feature, and I've seen some questions come up on there, and there's also a Q&A page, and I've seen some questions come up on there as well. So Lee Carney, Town Clerk in East Greenwich, has asked, and I think this can go to Sean, she might not have heard it the first time you said it, how do you show who is attending the meeting to the public?
Right. So unfortunately, these platforms they were built for specific, business focused reasons, the Zoom webinar and the Zoom meetings. And those are two very different products. And anyone who's hosted a meeting on the Zoom webinar platform is familiar with the fact that instead of one attendee list or participant list on the right margin, if you open up that toolbar, you have two. One is panelists and one are attendees. Panelists are visible and audible. Attendees are not visible or audible during the meeting. And if you are a panelist, you can see a list of the attendees, but you cannot. But if you are an attendee, you can only see the list of panelists. And so the thing that we're going to try out tonight for the first time is allowing a journalist to be a panelist just for that visibility into the attendee list, which they were not able to have before because they were just an attendee. Sorry for the background noise. But unfortunately, it's not possible today to use the Zoom webinar product and to have everyone attending the meeting be able to see everyone else who's attending the meeting. Only participants have that ability.
Thanks. Got a question from Erin Lease, Town Clerk in Jamestown, I think. For those doing hybrid meetings, what is the bare minimum staff to run each meeting? And Ashley, could you address that, please?
Sure. So I can tell you that in the Situate example, we have 2 staff people in the actual council chambers. We have the clerk for the board, and we have our IT person. Everyone else is virtual and participating, but not necessarily running any equipment or being responsible for hosting or regulating any part of the meeting. So we're managing to do it with 2 staff people that are responsible for those components, for the virtual person components. And Amy,
okay,
I added another poll because somebody suggested asking about experience. So I did throw up another poll for people to answer.
Okay, and you probably can't see it until I click end poll, is that it? All right, so less or more public participation. Yeah, roughly say more public participation, and interestingly about a third say less. Yeah, it's interesting, right? I think the general answer I've seen is more, but sometimes it's different folks, right? Sometimes, and I've seen elderly people say, you know, we can't do this, right? And I don't know how much effort they've made to reach out, because I think you all know the municipal staff for sure are generally bend over backwards to help people. And it's not necessarily, you know, you must have a laptop. It's, you know, you can utilize the phone option. So interesting. I'd be interested to know who's seen less public participation and in what context, because we've all had a lot of well-attended, lengthy meetings over the last year. Kate, I will ask you to handle this one from Susan Straub or Straub. Are there any accessibility issues that you can speak to, people who need an interpreter? And Amy, if you, after Kate speaks, if you have any experience with this with the DVR boards, please chime in as well.
Sure. So the Open Meetings Act itself, and this really isn't something that's specific to the executive order, you know, under the regular Open Meetings Act, there's requirements to comply with disability laws. And so in virtual meetings, I think, you know, as the question points out, interpreters are probably the issue that would come up the most. And so, I would encourage public bodies to do things like provide notice on the agenda, giving a way for people to reach out if they need services like an interpreter. And I know, you know, for us, for example, we conducted our annual Open Government Summit virtually for the first time this year, and we made arrangements to have closed captioning and interpreters present to make sure that anyone who's watching virtually would be able to really follow along with everything that was going on if they needed those kinds of services. So, you know, certainly I think those are the types of services that you want to keep in mind to see if anyone might need. There are different companies out there that can help provide access to companies that offer those services, including the Rhode Island Commission on Deaf and Hard of Hearing, which is a great resource. Go ahead, Amy Stewart, do you have more to add?
Thanks, Kate. I know we looked into this at DBR because anticipating that persons who are deaf and hard of hearing would have trouble with Zoom meetings. And we had another attorney colleague of mine reached out to the Commission on Deaf and Hard of Hearing, and they advised that there's a process. I don't know exactly how it would work for municipalities, but I'm sure they would be happy to educate you on whatever process is and who to reach out to for interpreters. But the interpreter would then participate in a Zoom meeting, just like we join the Zoom meetings individually, and would explain whatever the protocol is for pausing and allowing them to interpret if necessary, because you may need language interpreters for you know, Spanish speaking and other languages, and you know, we had to get those before, right? So when you've had those requests before, so they can figure out a way to talk about it ahead of time for them to join the meeting. I haven't had any of those requests yet, but DVR does have a standard blurb on all of its agendas saying, I think we've extended it to 5 days possible, assuming the agenda was posted 5 days, but you know, please give us notice ahead of time if you need accommodations, because we've got to line people up. So, you know, hopefully that's feasible within the time, or we could always continue it to make sure that they're getting the full due process rights before for their hearing.
And in that vein, Fiona Fitzpatrick has asked, how do you add closed captioning to Zoom? Sean, do you know if there is such an option?
There is, but there are a couple of different ways you can do it, and some are more effective than others, and I'm not an expert on this, so if someone else wants to chime in, then please feel free. But you can turn it on, and you do have to, as far as I understand, you do have to enable additional software, like add-on software to Zoom that you have to pay for, and that will try to do some type of voice-to-text, which sometimes is comically hysterical and not accurate, and other times is pretty good. But the alternative, which is probably recommended, especially by organizations that care about this, is that you would pay a human being to be dictating, to be transcribing basically live on the fly, and that is the text that would show up in the window instead of some machine trying to interpret people's language.
Okay. We have a little bit of what I would call a stumper question from Nick Lima. I'll read the whole question. The law requires boards of canvassers to convene and, quote, remain in session throughout the day, end quote, on election days, which take place simultaneously at multiple physical locations. It isn't physically or logistically possible to require that 15-hour meeting, which is publicly advertised meeting under OMA, to be broadcast live. What are we supposed to do if the executive order in a narrow example such as that is simply not possible to comply with? None of the 39 boards in the state broadcast their election day meetings live in November, nor could they. Similarly, when the board convenes to tabulate write-ins and mail ballots, it's an all-day or multi-day affair taking place not at computers or in a meeting room, but in multiple active and fluid locations, and while publicly advertised and accessible to the public to observe in person, it would not be physically possible without hiring a broadcast truck and multiple person camera crew to comply with the requirement that this type of meeting be broadcast the way any other type of traditional meeting would be. I would take a very brief initial response and then ask Kate if she has any thoughts. But my initial response would be, if it, to the extent you can think of creative ways to comply, you should try that. And perhaps one option there, I wouldn't call it strict compliance, right? But perhaps it could be video recorded. Now, if you said it happens in multiple sessions, in multiple locations, I guess you are talking multiple cameras. But where strict compliance is not possible, I would suggest simply use best efforts. And this is with the caveat that, of course, having seen that question right now, I haven't reviewed the specific issue. We know that boards of canvassers are subject to open meetings. So unless there's a specific rule that type of post-election meeting isn't covered by the OMA, I would say it is, and you've got to just do your best. Kate, do you have anything more official to add?
I don't know about official, but obviously that's a very specific question. Here are my general thoughts. So there's general case law and precedent that OMA is implicated when a quorum of a public body meets to discuss or take action on something within their purview. So I think as far as what the public should be able to see or what maybe needs to be virtually broadcast, I think that the main focus would be on when you have a quorum of the board together discussing or taking action on something. I'm not sure in the particular circumstances of every board of canvassers exactly which activities are taking place throughout the day, or exactly what parts of it would meet the definition of being a public meeting and subject to the OMA. So I don't think I can give an official, all-encompassing answer on that, but my initial thought is focusing around when a quorum are meeting and collectively acting or discussing something. And certainly, always trying to use best efforts to comply and to, really comply with the spirit of the OMA and the text of the OMA. But certainly some circumstances are harder than others. And the question of whether or not there's a violation is different than the question of whether it's willful or knowing. And, in those more difficult situations, that's also something that our office, generally speaking, keeps in mind too.
Thanks. And I see we just got a comment from Teresa Donovan that there are other meetings going on during the day of election event and the municipality may not have multiple Zoom accounts to run them simultaneously. So another general point, in our experience, right, people make complaints when they have an axe to grind. In the case of elections, there's a process for, contesting results right through the Board of Elections. So I would think someone with an axe to grind over results would be more likely to take it up there. And in general, I think the municipalities have done more or less across the board an excellent job of adapting to remote meetings. And to the extent you can try to communicate to citizens and constituents, hey, look how much work we've been doing, and here's how many people we've trained to facilitate meetings, and maybe even publish some statistics if you have them about increased participation and ways that you have gone above and beyond. For instance, it seems like many boards now, from councils to zoning and planning boards, are posting documents online before the meeting, which some did before COVID, but now it seems like it's become, if not a universal practice, it's getting there. That's not strictly required under the Open Meetings Act. It's absolutely encouraged and preferable, I think, for everyone, especially because we've all been to meetings where people ask questions about, well, X, Y, and Z, what's the answer? And it's like, well, if they had reviewed the document, the questions would be answered. Now they don't have the excuse of, well, I wasn't able to come in, I wasn't able to see it. It's there for everyone to see. So to the extent that you can educate people about how to access documents that will be discussed at a meeting, and just in general, and I think municipal employees are used to doing this, providing excellent customer service and making it known that if anyone has any questions, don't hesitate to pick up the phone. People might not be at their desks still, but the staff are available to answer questions. And one question following up on that vein of the municipality only has one Zoom account. Someone is asking, doesn't the Zoom login expire after a few hours? Sean, I also have questions about that as well. Could you clarify if you know whether there are any limits to meeting times using the Zoom webinar platform? And then Sean or Amy, maybe could you also clarify, I know that the state procured Zoom accounts for all municipalities. So do some municipalities use the state procured account and then one on their own? How does that work when you have to juggle multiple meeting times?
I'll let Amy go ahead and go first, because I think she actually has the bulk of the answers as opposed to me.
So as the Zoom host for the, I believe it was a real estate appraisers board, we do a webinar for open session, and an executive session is in the Zoom meeting. And we're coming out of the Zoom meeting and going back to the webinar for the open call and, report out what we did and vote to seal the minutes. And I can't get into the open session webinar because it expired. So that meeting starts at 9:30. I now set it up, depending on our executive session items, has to go longer than executive session. I was able to go into my Zoom meeting and extend the original scheduling from 2 hours to 3 hours, and then open it back up. And it only was a very short break, but I panicked. And what I've learned is you need to make sure that you schedule that Zoom meeting for hours and hours if people are going to log in later, or you're going to restart it at some point. So I just make sure I extend them. And then maybe really hard for some of your council or zoning or planning meetings, which I know you guys can have 5-hour long meetings, but I think it only expires if you're out of the meeting and want to go back in. You can always try to join it early, but it's once the end time expires. I don't know how long you can run that out for in the system, but it's probably at least 12 hours. But that, you always want to make sure your open session is longer than your executive session, at least, because otherwise you might not be able to get back into it. As far as the state accounts, I do know that there are some municipalities that have a second private account. We're hoping to be able to expand the state account in the future, so municipalities maybe can buy more than one, but I can't make any promises. But I have brought that to Director Tanner's attention, and there are discussions are being had within municipal finance. So they're aware of that need, that many municipalities have boards that need to meet at the same time, or maybe there needs to be an emergency council or school committee meeting. So you do need separate accounts for that. And for right now, if you need a second account, you could just buy the $15 a month Zoom meeting license, but it wouldn't have all the functionality that we have on the state account, which is the webinar and the toll-free phone numbers. So you would want to use that for meetings that have the smaller meetings with less attendance and less participation, because it's a simpler platform. You wouldn't want to use that for your council and other high-profile meetings. And it's just something that we've all learned to juggle, and you've got to pay attention and make sure that you're on the right account. Especially if you have two separate logins, they're not all within the same master account. Sean, believe you have 2 accounts with the City of Providence?
Yes, we have a few, and we use them in a similar fashion as you were just describing. I mean, I had the exact same experience that you had, where I didn't make the meeting long enough, and we tried to go back to it and learn the hard way, just like you. And I also use a less expensive Zoom meeting account for executive sessions, and use the more expensive Zoom webinar account for the regular sessions. And one thing that we do, although it might not be necessary, because I didn't hear you mention that you do this, but I actually hand over the host control to one of my staff, who stays on the regular session and keeps the session open, and they share their screen with a little sign that says, "Please wait while we are in executive session." And then so that staff person just stays in the regular session the whole time, and they could be sitting there for 2 hours. And I understand if a lot of municipalities and bodies don't have that resource. And I will say, just to share, I have actually used a second laptop sitting next to me because I'm comfortable with that, and I've passed off the host to that and shared the screen and left it up, and then used my own laptop to go into the executive session and come back, and then I return the host privileges back to myself, and then resume the meeting. So the regular session stays open the whole time. So yeah, I've just figured out unusual ways to make it happen, to reduce staff when I don't have it or whatever. And I will just add one other thing, as far as the Board of Canvassers, just an idea that I had just logistically. We're all using probably our own personal devices in ways that we hadn't before, as far as like cell phones, because I can't imagine that a lot of municipalities just went out and got cell phones for everyone. One possibility for these meetings where they're supposed to be available, since I don't know if there's two-way communication needed, but for the Board of Canvassers, you could use something like YouTube Live, where you just put up a cell phone and you don't need a Zoom account, and you stream, to YouTube, where it's being recorded live and it's preserved forever, and you can turn it on and off, go live, go off live, go live whenever there's something happening and there's a quorum present. I don't know if Kate feels like that would be reasonable instead of having a 14-hour Zoom meeting, but it's just an idea.
Good thought. I think this will be our last question because it's 2:15 now. I think there might be something else coming up soon. I don't know if it's a raffle. Fiona Fitzpatrick is asking if a board member who wants to participate experiences a poor connection or loses their connection, but a quorum remains, can the meeting proceed or should it be adjourned? I think one answer is it depends, because, for example, if it's a zoning board meeting, you need 5 members who are present to be able to hear something. Now, if someone cuts out for 2 minutes, I wouldn't see that as an issue. But if it's longer than that and they're taking testimony, yeah, that could potentially be an issue for appeal. In a different context, say if it's a council meeting, and someone, someone's kid pulls the plug on the router or the modem, I think it's fine if that person comes on later. I think the minutes should reflect if anyone had technical difficulties. So if someone was momentarily not present, but then again, think about the in-person meeting context. You didn't necessarily note every time in the meeting minutes when someone got up to use the restroom. So I guess the answer to that is it depends, and consider the context, and most importantly, consult with your solicitor or legal counsel. We are at 2:16 now. I want to thank on behalf of everyone on the panel and the league. Thank you for attending. It's been a pleasure to chat about this topic with you. I hope that some of the insights today were helpful, and look forward to seeing you all in person next year, and if not sooner. So I'm gonna stop the broadcast now and enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.